All right, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm just going to get started with a little intro here as folks come in. This webinar today is being recorded. The link to the recording will be emailed out to Standpoint's Legal Advocates listserv and also added to our YouTube page. My name is Jay. I'm an office manager here at Standpoint. My role today is going to help facilitate the webinar. So if anyone has questions during the presentation, please feel free to type them in the Zoom chat box, or you can use the Q&A tab and I'll pass the question along to our presenters. I'm also placing right now the Dropbox link in the chat. You can follow along with the PowerPoint there. And just a little intro of us. Most of you are probably already familiar about Standpoint, but for those who are listening later and who aren't as familiar, we are an organization of a team of attorneys and advocates working to assist individuals who have experienced domestic violence, sexual violence, and trafficking when it includes domestic or sexual violence. We also provide assistance to systems professionals who work with survivors. We do this by facilitating trainings and answering calls to our action line. Examples of the trainings we do are our annual new laws throughout the state of Minnesota, monthly webinars for advocates such as this one, and other trainings by request. Our action line is answered Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. And it's through our action line that our attorneys provide legal advice to survivors and our advocates connect callers with resources, safety plan, listen and help callers identify possible options and next steps. Now today I'm going to pass it off to our presenters today, Kia and Raelene.
Thanks, Jay. Hello, everyone. My name is Kia Whittier. I'm the underserved population support advocate here at Standpoint.
And hi, everyone. My name is Raelene, and I'm the housing advocate here.
So we are so excited to talk with you all today about the inequity of housing policies in Minnesota. We'll be going over a variety of different policies and practices that have occurred and still are occurring within Minnesota. And we'll end with hopefully just a little bit of hope about things that you can try and do and take some action to push back against some of these inequities. So with that, we can go to the next slide. So Jay did talk about Standpoints a bit, and I just wanted to highlight some of the areas in which our attorneys and advocates have expertise. And so our attorneys specialize in immigration law, civil law, criminal, family, housing, and employment law, as well as Title IX. And our advocates also have a breadth of knowledge in legal advocacy and safety planning, resource referrals, and providing support to advocacy organizations as well. So if you are an advocate listening on this call, know that we are here to support you and answer your questions as well. And we provide services to the entire state. What I love about Standpoint is that we're free. We don't have any sort of intake. And I think that pushes back against a lot of barriers that can be present for folks. So anyone can call us and we'll answer the phone and talk with an attorney and advocate. So with that, I'll just pass it on to Raelene to get us started.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Kia. All right. So to kind of get us started today, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the housing policies and practices here in Minnesota that have created a system of inequality. This is not, legal advice or a legal analysis. This is just kind of what kind of laws and things were passed and how they impacted the communities that we have here. So Richard Rothstein, author of The Color of Law, argues that the inequity we see in housing today is a result of these policies and practices that have been put in place throughout our history. So we'll start by talking a little bit about covenants, racially restrictive covenants in particular. And then we'll also talk about redlining, which is kind of related to that. And then I will finish this portion off by talking a little bit about public housing and some of the history there. Know that there are a lot more policies and practices that have happened on federal levels, all the way down to local zoning codes and things like that. We're just going to use a few examples to kind of show how inequity was built into our system through here in Minnesota specifically. So first we'll talk about restrictive covenants. So we've kind of heard a lot of news attention here, specifically in the Twin Cities area, about restrictive covenants or racial covenants. But before we dive into that, we have to figure out what is a restrictive covenant in general. So what are they? Essentially, a restrictive covenant is an agreement that states what a homeowner can or cannot do with their house or their land. It's contract language that can be found in the deed to the property, and it's written into the deed or contract of the property by the seller, and they are considered legally binding. So if someone purchases a property and doesn't follow that covenant, they can face fines, lawsuits, or even foreclosures. Restrictive covenants can be simple or complicated, and they cover many issues across the board, like including not letting owners make changes to the property or operate businesses on the land. So why do we have these restrictive covenants? If they do, I mean, they are restricting what you can and can't do with your own property. So why are they helpful, or why have people used them in the past? Oftentimes, these covenants exist to promote uniformity within neighbors or housing developments. So a covenant might set a lower limit on the size of a house within a development, or even regulate the color and style of the home being built. It might limit the number of homes that can be built on a lot to ensure the same size, like uniformity of yard size and things like that, or establish a particular distance the house must be set back from the street. So by maintaining this uniformity throughout the neighborhood, the idea is that covenants protect the property value of the included properties. Covenants can be positive, so requiring someone to do something, or negative, of course, which means prohibiting someone from doing something. So positive covenant can require upkeep, like taking care of yard work in a timely manner or repairing visible areas of the house. And then negative covenants can prohibit the owner from building like a swing set in the front yard, or maybe putting up a fence, for example. So when I think about covenants, they make the most sense to me when I think about townhomes and like homeowners associations or HOAs. These organizations tell the owners and sometimes tenants who are living in those homes all kinds of things about their property, some of the things that we just talked about. From appropriate times to have decorations out, the color of your front door, the number of tenants you can have in the unit. And again, it's about maintaining uniformity and property values of the home. So if I'm being honest, when I think about these, I mostly, and townhomes, I mostly think about everything looking the same. So I'm always getting lost in these townhome developments. But the idea, again, is to keep everything looking the same so that property values remain high. So those are some of the restrictive covenants that we have for other reasons, but we'll talk a little bit more about these racially restrictive covenants that I think have gotten a little bit more news attention. Before we do that though, a little bit of context. So into the early 1930s, many urban neighborhoods in the United States were populated by both white, largely immigrant, and also Black working class families. At that time, factories were typically located in the downtown areas, and their employees generally lived nearby and walked to work. Because of the diversity of men employed by the factories, these neighborhoods tended to be a little bit more integrated. At the heart of many of these same cities and towns was a railroad station oftentimes, and because railroads often hired African Americans as baggage handlers or porters, these men and their families also lived in the downtown neighborhoods. So the makeup of downtown looked a little bit different than it does today. Despite this trend of cities initially being integrated, this began to change into the early 1900s when these racially restrictive covenants became widely used across the country. As we talked about, these covenants were written into property deeds nationwide with the explicit intent of keeping people who were not white from buying or even occupying land. So instead of requiring the owner to paint their door a certain color or something along those lines, these covenants specified who could and could not buy the property based on race and sometimes even religion. Specifically before 1919, anti-Semitism was particularly strong here in the metro area, and there was a lot of discrimination that Jewish families were facing. In Minneapolis, the first racially restrictive deed appeared in 1910 when Henry and Lenora Scott sold a property on 35th Avenue South to Nels Anderson. The deed conveyed in the transaction contained what would become a common restriction, stipulating that the quote premises shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. And that was very specifically spelled out in the deed. Henry Scott then became president of a real estate development company that put this same exact language into thousands of deeds across the city. And while covenants look different in different parts of the country and even at different times, the common themes is that they were all pretty blunt. Even reading what these covenants say can be really kind of hard to see those words in a legal document. For example, one common Minneapolis covenant reads, quote, the said premises shall not at any time be sold, conveyed, leased, or sublet, or occupied by any person or persons who are not full bloods of the so-called Caucasian or white race. So there was sometimes an exception for class and profession. So there was a deed in the city of Richfield in 1937 that had the following language, quote, race or nationality other than white persons shall use or occupy any dwelling on any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent the occupancy by domestic servants of a different race when employed by the owner or the tenant. So they were very explicit and very blunt about who was allowed to be there. And these covenants had a drastic impact. So African-American folks were routinely pushed into just a few small areas of the city. And as they were pushed into certain neighborhoods, other neighborhoods were becoming completely white. We can see the impact of this segregation today in the way that our cities are housed. And according to Mapping Prejudice, these deeds were the brainchild of the real estate industry, but they were quickly embraced by public officials who saw them as a way to promote neighborhood stability. Even the National Association of Real Estate Boards codified this into its Code of Ethics, which declared in 1924 that a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to the property values in that neighborhood. So the consistent theme here is, again, that we deemed the value of the property more important than a person of color having a home of their own. These covenants were so widespread across the country that the issue eventually made its way to the Supreme Court, who ruled in 1948 that these racist covenants were unenforceable. The Minnesota legislature prohibited the use of racial restrictions in warranty deeds in 1953, but they were not made explicitly illegal across the country until 1968 and the Fair Housing Act, which we'll touch on a little bit later. While these steps are important to stopping restrictive covenants, the racism still remained. In 1946, 60% of Minnesotans surveyed believed that African Americans should not have the freedom to live in any neighborhood. 68% asserted that a non-white neighbor would hurt their property values. So again, coming back to the value of your property. It's important to recognize that these covenants are deeply rooted in white supremacy, and there were clear lines of who benefited from them. So Mapping Prejudice tells us that real estate developers use these racial covenants to sell houses, promising home buyers that these covenants would protect their investments. They also worked with park commissioners to make land adjacent to racially restricted neighborhoods into public green space. So these parks, they argued, would enhance the value of the property in the new neighborhoods. And additionally, of course, white homeowners also profited from these racial covenants. A team of University of Minnesota researchers demonstrated that Minneapolis houses that had covenants are worth 14% more than identical houses that never had any covenants. And that bonus value still persists today, which is really intense to think about, that a covenant from such a long time ago can still have a financial benefit to people who are owning those houses today. So next we'll talk a little bit about redlining. And this one is it's related to these covenants in a way as well. So in 1934, the Federal Housing Administration was established to facilitate home financing, improve housing standards, and increase employment in the home construction industry in the wake of the Great Depression. So the FHA insures mortgages made by private lenders for single family properties and multifamily rental properties, hospitals, and residential care facilities. Their role was to rate risk factors for government-backed mortgages and use FHA insurance to protect those lenders against losses. At that time, the stock market had just crashed a few years ago, and our country was in the middle of the Great Depression. So many people were losing their homes and couldn't afford to buy new homes. So with an FHA secured loan, people had to put down a smaller down payment, so it lowered it to about 10%. And a mortgage payment, instead of being 5 to 10 years, increased to 20 to 30 years to assist people in staying stably housed. So in order to accomplish this, the FHA created an underwriting manual for appraisers of homes to use that stated, if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that properties shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy generally leads to instability and a reduction of values. So again, back to property values. Appraisers were then told to give higher property and zoning ratings where protections against some adverse influences is obtained, and those adverse influences were defined as an infiltration by inharmonious racial or nationality groups. So again, writing this into the practices of how we lend money to people to buy homes. So in 1935, the Homeowners Loan Corporation looked at cities across the US and created what they called residential security maps to indicate the level of risk associated with lending in a certain area. They labeled these neighborhoods best, still desirable, declining, and hazardous. Hazardous were the red areas, which is where we get the term redlining from. And these were often neighborhoods comprised of people of color, immigrant groups, and Jewish families. Areas described as best were often affluent white neighborhoods. So areas where the redlining was folks that were living in the red areas of these maps were very unlikely to have loans underwritten for them. The drawing of the red lines around the areas that were racially segregated became standard practice and supported by law, and is a major contributing factor to the racial and wealth gaps we still see today. So, I think it's important to think while these covenants were made unenforceable by the Supreme Court in 1948, prohibited in the Minnesota legislature in 1953, and being banned in 1968 as a part of the Fair Housing Act, why is it still important to think about this today? Mapping prejudice tells us that separate is not equal. In the United States, racial segregation channels the flow of resources. So where you live determines access to different community assets. Majority white neighborhoods have more parks and more generous tree cover. Communities of color have more environmental hazards like landfills and highways, and Kia will tell us about highways later. They have less access to medical care, which translates to higher rates of infant mortality and premature birth. Schools in these neighborhoods usually have fewer experienced teachers and less challenging curriculums. Some institutions beat those odds, but most struggle to maintain the resources necessary to meet the needs of their communities. Studies have shown that neighborhoods have an enormous influence on their residents' potential for success. According to the study, moving from a high poverty neighborhood to a low poverty neighborhood raised incomes by 31%, improved college attendance, and reduced teenage pregnancies. So where you live has a huge impact on your health and well-being. By the time that the covenants were abolished, the damage was done. The practice itself may not have been allowable, but the impact was clear. African-American people were either forced into certain areas, out of certain areas, or not able to buy property at all. And we know that the best way for someone to accrue generational wealth is through home ownership. Minneapolis has the lowest African-American home ownership rates in the country, which continues to fuel our current racial wealth gap. While with home ownership comes many financial benefits over time. According to a study conducted by the National Association of Realtors, the typical homeowner accumulates around $175,000 in home equity in the span of 30 years. And over 30 years, that wealth is increased to over $300,000. Homeowners also tend to have higher savings balances, earn higher incomes than renters in other areas, and receive numerous tax benefits. So I think it's really important to be rectifying these mistakes that we've made in the past. And there's a website up on the screen called justdeeds.org. And I think Kia will touch on it later as well. Right now, they are focused primarily in Hennepin County, but they are able to assist people in looking at the deeds to their properties to see if there is a racially restrictive covenant in place, and they can help give legal advice to get rid of that. And I was just looking at the website today, and it looks like they've gotten rid of 404 of those covenants. Again, even though they're unenforceable, it is important that we reconcile with our past and make changes so that we can do better going forward. All right, so next we'll talk a little bit about the history of public housing. Very, very brief history, very high level. I think it's important to know that public housing was created in response to the housing shortage and financial crisis of the Great Depression. So the government-sponsored homes was the answer. Again, it sounds nice, but we'll see how it all played out. So public housing is the oldest and until recently largest housing subsidy program in the country. Today's 1.1 million units of public housing, operated by over 3,000 local public housing agencies, serve about 2.2 million residents. Not to be confused with other housing subsidy programs, public housing is housing stock that is owned by HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and is administered by local PHAs or public housing authorities. So the federal housing programs began as a part of the Housing Act of 1937. The country was facing the effects of the Great Depression, and this act created around 160,000 units of housing to help low-income families impacted by the Great Depression. Funds were then delivered to local public housing authorities to build and also manage these units. A program of the New Deal, called the Public Works Administration, was tasked with building the first federal public housing project called Techwood Homes in Atlanta, Georgia. In order to start this project, however, around 1,600 low-income and Black families were evicted from their homes that were located where the public housing was to be built, only to make way for a whites-only neighborhood. This was an intentional act and was common for the beginning of many public housing authorities. Interestingly enough, these homes were again demolished in 1996 for the Olympics, which again displaced many families. Public housing was then again expanded under the Housing Act of 1949, expanding funding to provide 800,000 more public housing units across the country. In 1954, the year the Supreme Court decided in Brown v. Board of Education that separate but equal was anything but, the Housing and Home Finance Agency stated that this did not apply to housing. So segregated housing persisted even into the 60s and 70s. In 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed. And while this is not a Fair Housing Act training, there's lots to learn there. Essentially, the Fair Housing Act prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on your race, religion, national origin, and sex. It was later amended to also prohibit discrimination based on disability and family status. This act built upon some of these previous housing acts and was intended to be a follow-up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The day that the Senate was to vote on this bill was the same day that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. So there was some significant social pressure to address this discrimination. It was the first time that Congress declared it illegal for private individuals to discriminate on the basis of race in the sale or rental of housing. So the law successfully made these individual acts of explicit racial discrimination in housing transactions illegal, and residential segregation by race has since declined. But the Fair Housing Act never fully delivered on its promise to promote and further integration. But in 1968, residential segregation was very high at the time. And again, the legislation policies were supporting it, but white folks were also deeply committed to that racism. They used all legal and illegal means, including cross burnings, arson, and physical attacks to keep Black folks out of their neighborhoods. They formed thousands of homeowner organizations, complete with block captains, and the express purpose was to keep Black people out of their neighborhoods. And quite frankly, when these methods failed, they moved to the suburbs. After the passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, public housing would no longer be a tool for advancing segregation. Just 6 years later, the federal government started a steady withdrawal of support for public housing, beginning with President Nixon's moratorium on housing spending in 1974. There had been no significant expansion of public housing since then, as federal housing subsidies shifted to housing vouchers. Into the 1980s, under President Reagan, the quality of housing, public housing began to decline, to the point where Congress ended up creating the National Commission on Severely Distressed Public Housing to survey the condition of public housing across the country. The commission found that only a small percentage, about 6%, was severely distressed. And so they did appropriate $6 million in funding, which was publicized as urban renewal efforts to demolish distressed units and then replace them with mixed income housing. Unfortunately, as we have seen in the past, that hadn't worked well for people already established in their homes, usually communities of color. Because of this, over 50,000 households were told that they would be temporarily relocated, but fewer than half of them could return to their repaired homes, and even fewer could afford the new mixed income housing that was built instead. Ultimately, this left tens of thousands of public housing renters displaced and drastically decreased the public housing stock. Despite the consistent attempts to undermine public housing and media portrayals of dilapidated, crime-riddled tower buildings, the program remains popular among its residents. In the book, Housing Policy in the United States, the author notes that public housing is unpopular with everybody except those who live in it and those who are waiting to get in. Today, there are around 958,000 public housing units located in all 50 states and several territories, with 1 in 5 of them being in rural areas. As of 2019, only 47% of public housing homes were in low or moderate poverty areas, or were less than 30% of people had low incomes. Public housing remains concentrated in racially segregated, under-resourced neighborhoods. And while the waitlist for public housing is years or decades long, no funds have been provided to build additional public housing since the mid-1990s. In fact, the number of public housing units has fallen by more than 200,000 since the mid-90s, as housing agencies have been demolished or removed from the stock of public housing because of that deterioration and underfunding. Only a small share of the removed units have been replaced with new public housing. So kind of on the flip side of that, I will let Kia take it over and talk a little bit about gentrification.
Gave us a wealth of knowledge, and I'm just sitting over here dumbfounded at like the fact that funds haven't been given to like build new public housing since the 90s. That blows my mind. So yeah, on the flip side of that, I don't think we can talk about housing policies and practices without, and just the inequity within housing without talking about gentrification. So gentrification, Raelene, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, please. Thank you. Gentrification is a process of neighborhood change where higher income and higher educated residents move into a historically marginalized neighborhood. Housing costs rise and the neighborhood is physically transformed through newer, higher end construction and building upgrades, resulting in the displacement of vulnerable residents and changes to the neighborhood's cultural character. It's really just, whole communities being uprooted when rents rise, when there's investments in the community. And I'm going to break this down more, but this definition just really gives a nice summary of what gentrification is. So now that we know generally what it is, how does it begin? Well, new businesses and amenities pop up catering to new wealthier residents. Potholes might get filled, a new bus line might appear, landlords raise rents to what new residents can afford to pay, so the original tenants get forced out. And real estate speculators may pressure homeowners to sell their family homes. Like Raelene was talking about with redlining and racial covenants, those things prevented Black families from renting homes or taking out mortgages in certain neighborhoods, therefore helping create concentrated poor communities of color, right? They're being pushed out from these neighborhoods where they were living, now have to move into these other neighborhoods, creating just, this concentration, right? So then local governments began removing resources from those non-white communities, and property speculators looked at these neighborhoods as prime targets, trying to make money and bring in new, wealthier, non-Black, non-person of color residents, okay? So what we have to really look at here are the historic conditions. What policies and practices from the past make communities susceptible to gentrification, right? I mean, just because there was, I'm thinking like gentrification or, sorry, not gentrification, redlining and these racial covenants that happened in the past, we're still seeing these effects today. And we can kind of look at the history of that to help gauge and give an idea of like where or what neighborhoods could begin to become gentrified. So with that, onto the next slide, please. The Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the U of M, University of Minnesota, they conducted a study on gentrification in Minneapolis and St. Paul between 2000 and 2015. So for 15 years, they conducted this study. And this was a mixed methods approach that was used that combined a statistical analysis of neighborhood level data with an in-depth qualitative analysis of interviews with public officials, community leaders, and neighborhood residents. And so this study, unsurprisingly, right, found a significant evidence of gentrification in both Minneapolis and St. Paul. But what I wanted to highlight here from this study is that they interviewed 10 local community-based organizations who conceptualized gentrification as taking place along an extended period of time, characterized by 4 stages. So the first stage is disinvestment and decline. So this is when, and will occur when powerful public and private institutions redirect resources away from a community. Okay, and you'll probably notice the theme here about intentionality. This is all on purpose. It's all very intentional, right? These public and private institutions taking this money away. Okay, and then we have devaluation. And devaluation, I would say this is when a deficit narrative comes up. So this deficit narrative comes to really dominate elite and public discourse about communities that have been subject to disinvestment. So we have these various communities who, I mean, really these affluent people who are talking about this community and its poor conditions, its degradation, and that creates this narrative, right, about it. Maybe there's opportunity there because it is so dilapidated, and now we can maybe invest, which leads to the next stage, which is reinvestment. And this is when low land values and rents are exploited, housing costs rise, and businesses and cultural institutions may turn over. So they're putting money back into this community, but we're raising the cost of everything. And like I just said, with businesses and cultural institutions turning over, it's not that they align with the community that had already been there, right? These are new businesses and institutions that reflect with the new residents they're trying to bring into this community. And lastly, displacement. And so displacement occurs in various forms. I'm going to talk about it on the next slide, but it really occurs when the loss of affordability pushes out long-term residents and businesses. There's a change in conditions for those who are able to remain, and it precludes the entry of new lower income households. So I know I just said a lot right there, but just to summarize, really, gentrification is this intentional process. It occurs over an extended period of time, and there's a disinvestment, there's talk about this community, reinvesting back in it, but purposely making sure the money that goes into it isn't contributing to the people who have already lived there, and then pushing people out. So with that, I want to talk about displacement in more depth. So there are three different kinds of displacement. We have direct, indirect, and cultural. And so direct displacement, this occurs when residents can no longer afford to remain in their homes due to rising housing costs. They may also be forced out by lease non-renewals, evictions, eminent domain, or physical conditions that really render these homes uninhabitable as investors are awaiting redevelopment opportunities. Like leeches, I'm just going to call it for what it is, right? They're waiting for these people to just purposely be pushed out, right? And while displacement, it occurs routinely in low-income neighborhoods, it does. But when it occurs in the context of new development and an influx of wealthier residents, the displacement becomes a characteristic of gentrification, right? So I just want to make that note because displacement isn't just gentrification, and gentrification really, sorry, let me rewind here. Gentrification, a characteristic of that is displacement, but displacement can occur on its own, and it does. But we have indirect displacement. And so this refers to changes in who is moving into a neighborhood as low-income residents move out. So in a gentrifying neighborhood, when homes are vacated by low-income residents, other low-income residents, they can't afford to move in because rents and sale prices have increased. And you may have, if you've heard of displacement before, and indirect displacement, this has also been called exclusionary displacement. I'm struggling with that word, displacement. Okay. But it's also called exclusionary displacement. And so low-income residents, they can be excluded as a result of discriminatory policies, like, a ban on tenants with housing vouchers, for example, or changes in land use or zoning that foster change in the character of residential development, okay? And then lastly, we have cultural displacement. And so this occurs as the scale of residential change advances. So shops and services, they're shifting to focus on new residents. The character of a neighborhood is transformed, and the remaining residents may feel a sense of dislocation despite remaining in the neighborhood, right? There's this sense that they don't belong anymore because they're seeing a brewery pop up. They've never had that before. Maybe that's something that doesn't align with the community in any way. They got rid of their local community center to build a music venue, and some of those, I don't know if those are the best examples to use, but it's just changing the resources and the resources that were available in the community, I guess I would say. So with that, I wanted to provide an example for you all of what gentrification and displacement looks like here in our states, and for those who are in the metro area right here in the cities. And some folks on this call now or who are watching this later may be familiar with this, but it's about the Rondo neighborhood in I-94. And so the Rondo neighborhood was once home to 80% of St. Paul's Black residents. And this community consisted of working class folks, and they were supported by social clubs, religious organizations, community centers, and a thriving business community. It was home to doctors and lawyers, barbers and maids, civil rights leaders, and porters at the time. So the Federal Highway Act was created in the 50s, 56 actually. And this was a congressional authorization of $1.85 billion. Okay, so 1950s, $1.85 billion. I don't even know what that is right now, but that's still a lot of money. And again, they authorized this money to build an interstate system between 1957, 56 to 1959. And Minnesota's I-94 project was at the top of the list to receive these funds, okay? So what's interesting to note, though, is that there were two options. Raelene, would you mind going to the next slide really quick? We'll go back to this one, but what I just want to show here is that there were two options. So there's a northern route, which is in green, and then the Rondo St. Anthony route, which is in orange on the bottom there. And so the northern route, for those who are familiar with the area, that's Pierce Butler Road, which is for the most part like an already industrial area. And the Rondo St. Anthony route at the time was just residential, was neighborhoods, right? So despite there being these two routes, the highway department officials, they felt they needed to place convenience above the social impact of their plan, and that their decision to go with the Rondo St. Anthony route was the best route for growth of the area. So they, again, placed convenience above social impact. And you can see, maybe kind of hard to see, but towards the bottom right, along the orange line there, you can see a blue outline, and that is the Rondo St. Anthony route. And another critique of this too, using this route, was that it ended up splitting the Capitol with the other like government buildings downtown, which people did not like as well. But would you mind going back to the previous slide, Raelene? Thank you. So with that, the neighborhood was split in half, causing the loss of 700 homes, around 300 mostly Black owned businesses, and a significant drop in population and home ownership. There was a built-in safety net here, right? And that safety net of community was scattered. Hundreds of millions of dollars of community wealth was lost. And like Raelene had said earlier, generational wealth is built this way, right? Homeownership is a huge factor in generational wealth. And many families didn't receive fair market value for their homes. I mean, the city demanded that residents sell their homes to the city for dirt cheap prices, often really only a fraction of the actual property value. And discriminatory housing practices, like Raelene talked about earlier, redlining and restrictive covenants, they gave families limited choices of where they could move. And it just really made it nearly impossible for families to buy homes elsewhere. And business owners, it was also a challenge for them to find additional space for their businesses. And what I'm hoping y'all are starting to get and are maybe connecting the dots here when we're talking about these restrictive covenants, redlining, gentrification, and displacement, thinking about these communities, specifically BIPOC communities being uprooted and destroyed, and affluent white folks coming into these neighborhoods. There's going to be some violence, right? Because there's a group of people that are uncomfortable with residents, with tenants, people who have lived in this community for so long. And what I'm getting at here is that there was a lot of like police violence that occurred. That might not be shocking to folks, but it's something I wanted to name. People that refused to vacate their homes within the Rondo neighborhood, when they refused to vacate their homes or their businesses, they were met by police with sledgehammers, destroying walls, smashing windows, and even tearing apart the plumbing. They wanted to find any way they could to make sure that these residents did not return to their homes. Like, you don't belong here anymore. This is not yours. We're taking this over, and we're going to destroy your house to make sure that that doesn't happen. And it's gross to even say that, because I can't imagine what that actually was like watching that happen. I was reading the story about this young boy who had come home to his grandparents' house, and they were the last house on at least maybe of that portion of the Rondo neighborhood. And when he walked in, he saw police tearing up so much stuff within the home just to make sure that his grandma and grandpa didn't come back to the home. Just very, very gross. But what I want to call out too is that this is very clearly like racism, right? We're building a new highway that mostly benefited white Minnesotans at the expense of a strong, thriving Black neighborhood. And what is really, really important to note here is that, again, like hundreds of millions of dollars of wealth was gone from this community, and they're still recovering from that to this day. And in one story I was reading, there was a resident who had said that it will never fully recover or restore what was lost. There could be economic projects that create jobs and development and infrastructure to better that area in some way, but it will never fully restore what was lost, because it wasn't just homes. It was a sense of belonging and community that was destroyed. And so why are we talking about this? Well, I wanted to use this as an example of policy that purposely destroyed a thriving community. It was intentional in every way possible, right? That we had another option, chose not to go with it because it wasn't as convenient. So with that, really, if you would go not to the next slide, but the one after. Thank you. So this is a Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul in 1940 and 2020. Do not ask me why the one in 2020 is black and white, but it is. As you can see, there's a lot of homes here in this area on the left side, 1940. And then on the right, you can see that hundreds of homes were lost, were destroyed, actually. So just wanted to share that with you all to get a sense of, get a visual of what was gone, what was removed. So now I want to talk about gentrification and sexual violence. So because we're Standpoint and we work with victim survivors of sexual and domestic violence, we have to talk about that, right? And everything we've talked about thus far, though, I hope you all know that it does impact survivors. Like, survivors have been impacted by these decisions. So we may not have named it right then, but hopefully you all know that this impacts them as well. So how gentrification and sexual violence intersect, and you may be wondering, how am I going to really connect the dots here? Well, forms of violence and oppression that target marginalized communities, let's think like genocide, racism, transphobia, or ableism, they make sexual and domestic violence more likely to happen to people within those communities, right? And this is because oppression creates conditions where people who are power up are at an increased risk of doing violence, and people who are powered down have increased vulnerability and increased exposure to those who could harm them. And because oppressive structures promote sexual and domestic violence and discourage cultural norms of healthy, collaborative, mutually respectful relating and relationships, right? These oppressive structures are nixing that completely. So that being said, now that we kind of know how violence and oppression make or target marginalized communities and make it more likely to happen within those communities, we have to also think about a strategy that the United States and many other nations have used when the nation was formed, right? Even though we know that the United States was stolen from our indigenous relatives, the United States used imperialism as a strategy to come to exist and to wield power. They would promote values of exploitation and extraction and degradation, dehumanization, and of course the violence and power. And these values were used for some at the expense of others. So based in these values, the state exploits communities by stealing land and resources, violates people using campaigns of sexual, physical, and psychological violence, exploits and disinvests in communities, removes resources from them, and then blames them for their own degraded and vulnerable conditions, which are in fact the product of state intervention. And that kind of sounds like one, just an abusive relationship and gaslighting, right? They're blaming these communities for their own conditions and the reliance on the state, but they're the ones that caused this to happen in the first place. So one of the ways in which this occurs is structurally, and that is through gentrification as an example. And so it's through policies and practices that neglect entire neighborhoods, often historically Black or immigrant areas, followed by policies and practices of, like I said before, displacement, intervention, development, and upgrading that dramatically change the demographics of those who can afford to live in the area and then push out those who have historically dwelled there. So this is an example that demonstrates just one of the ways state intervention using tactics of oppression that directly and indirectly promote and enables sexual and domestic violence to happen. Because there's, again, this group that has power and this group that doesn't. And as I'm going to assume you all know, for those who are advocates or other systems professionals in this space, we know what power can do and the impact that can have on those without it, especially when we're looking at systems and our government who can just choose to take, and they don't care who they take from. And so lastly, I just wanted to end on with this piece is that displacement, it opens really just the opportunity for vulnerability and exploitation in already over-policed areas, over-policed communities, and just communities where once that were thriving and now are vulnerable. And this just creates conditions, like I said, for sexual and domestic violence to occur. So with that, I will pass it back to Raelene.
Great. Thank you so much, Kia. I think that, many of us have seen gentrification happening around our neighborhoods or in spaces that we've been in, but it's really important to think about the fact that this is intentional work that is happening. And those 4 stages, I think, are really important in how we think about how neighborhoods are transforming and where that comes from and where it begins. We're going to take a little bit of a shift here. We're going in a little bit of a new direction. So we're going to bring it back to Minnesota. So we're going to think through evictions and what does housing look like today? So this chart here is from Homeline. Homeline is an awesome tenants' rights advocacy organization here in Minnesota. And according to their website right now on their hotline, they operate pretty similar to how Standpoint does. Evictions remain at the top of the list of things that people have called about for the last 3 months. And that's not normal. So, we know that in a typical year, landlords file 3.7 million eviction cases across the state, across the country. And most of those evictions here in Minnesota are due to non-payment of rent. And right now, the levels of evictions is spiking here in the state. And I think that's because the eviction protections have ended from the moratorium, and a lot of people have been behind on rent, and Rent Help MN is no longer assisting with those payments going forward. So these numbers are increasing. I think just because I'm particularly passionate about it at the moment, the landlord's notice to vacate is also on that list as well. And I think that that's something we should be paying attention to as well. So it's different than an eviction, feels very similar to the tenant. Anyway, so yes, these evictions here in Minnesota have spiked. And landlords filed nearly 1,800 evictions in May, which is about 500 more than May 2019. So thinking pre-pandemic levels. Specifically in Minneapolis and St. Paul, of the 6,504 eviction filings since March 15th, 4,303 were filed in Hennepin County and 2,201 were filed in Ramsey County, just to give you an idea of what we're looking at. I think it's important to note that single Black mothers face the highest risk of eviction in the United States. And that is something that we know about Minneapolis in particular. So from 2013 to 2015, approximately 50% of renter households in North Minneapolis experienced at least one eviction filing, and that's at a rate almost 25% higher than the zip code 55402 right next door, which experienced the next highest rate of eviction filings in the city of Minneapolis. So this disparity is particularly relevant given that those two zip codes, so North Minneapolis and 55402, contain only 8% of all rental units in the city. North Minneapolis is a community that has been created by housing discrimination, decades of urban disinvestment, unfair lending practices, and disproportionate evictions for a long time. And the situation has become further exacerbated by the rise in distressed property investment. And we also know that single Black women with children living below the poverty line lead more than 60% of the Black households in North Minneapolis. And I think that that's really indicative of where these policies have led us, to know that so many Black families are facing eviction in just two zip codes in Minneapolis. Not even all of Minneapolis, not even all of Hennepin County, but where there are small numbers of rentals and large numbers of evictions. So I think it's important to remember all of the things that we have talked about, from the historical practices like racially restrictive covenants, again, beginning in Minneapolis, here in Minnesota, and redlining, all the way through displacement and gentrification, disinvestment and discrimination. All of these things have helped create these conditions here in Minnesota, and specifically Minneapolis. We like to blame the person who hasn't paid their rent for their eviction, but it's about so much more than what people are doing today. It's the system that we've created through segregationist and discriminatory practices. All right, so let's just to think about evictions. We hear that term a lot. Let's think a little bit about what it means to have an eviction on your record. So as a matter of public policy, we have decided that we need transparency in our judicial systems. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and it can be really helpful in a lot of ways. So the court keeps records of everything that has happened in the courtroom and makes those records available to the public. There are some that are sealed, of course, for confidentiality reasons, to protect kiddos, things like that. But the general rule is that court records are available to the public. The way that the system works is that as soon as a document is filed with the court, that document is noted on the court docket and made available. For many courts, records are searchable and accessible online, and this is particularly true for eviction records. So one problem with eviction records, though, is that they often result in long-term homelessness, because the housing market is so tight that landlords can easily have a policy to deny applicants with an eviction on their record. Of course, it is true that in some cases, a prior eviction record could be an indicator that the applicant is unsafe to rent to, but in many cases, that's actually not true. And we see this a lot with tenants who were evicted as a result of being the victim of domestic violence. So with an eviction, the tenant has an eviction on their record the moment that it is filed with the court. Oftentimes, this is before the tenant even knows that it's happening. The landlord has turned paperwork into the court, and then again, it shows up on their record. And the eviction remains on the record even if the case was dismissed because it shouldn't have been filed in the first place. There was something wrong with that, with the filing or the reasoning, or when the parties enter into a settlement agreement either at or before the court hearing, and the tenant pays and stays in the property. So even if the tenant doesn't move out because everything has been settled up and rent has been paid or whatever, the issues have been taken care of, that eviction is still on the record. Or even when the tenant moved out before the eviction was filed. So in all of those situations, the eviction still shows up on someone's record and still follows them as they're searching for new housing. And of course, the courts have a process for getting rid of court records called expungement. And Standpoint is happy to talk with folks about looking into expungement as an option, but it is limited and it requires writing and filing a motion, attending a hearing, paying a filing fee of about $300. And it's not a guaranteed thing. You still have to make an argument. And that is a far better question for Anne to talk more about in some of our eviction training. So if you want to know more about that, please call. But it's not a guaranteed, right? So this eviction record, again, is thinking about value and monetary value rather than the person who is seeking new housing or facing that eviction. So again, it comes down to money, which I think is really problematic. So kind of like Kia was talking about, we are Standpoint. We are advocates. We're working with folks that have experienced domestic and sexual violence. So I think it's important to know some of these policies and how we've gotten to where we are. We know that finding safe and stable housing is an essential piece of any victim survivor safety plan. And I can almost guarantee that you in your work have probably worked with someone trying to find housing that is safe and affordable, which feels almost impossible these days. Whether due to the rental market, an individual's particular background, the cost, or I would argue the impact of the racist and segregationist policies and gentrification that we've talked about today. So this means that more and more victim survivors are experiencing homelessness. Like Kia said, all of these things that we've been talking about, while we didn't necessarily analyze them from the lens of domestic and sexual violence, they impact survivors, absolutely. So let's look at what does homelessness look like here in Minnesota. So back in 2018, many of you are probably familiar with Wilder, and they do their point in time count, where they go around, I believe in January, and talk with folks that are experiencing homelessness about what that experience has been like for them, to learn more about who is experiencing homelessness and what does homelessness look like here in Minnesota. So what we learned is that nearly 6 in 10, so about 58% of homeless adults report experiencing at least one act of abuse or violence measured in the survey, and that women are more likely than men to have these experiences. The 3 most common experiences were staying in an abusive relationship because they didn't have any other housing options, being in a personal relationship with someone who was abusive within the last year, and being physically or sexually attacked while experiencing homelessness. So you could be homeless because of the violence that you've experienced, or homeless and then experience violence because you were experiencing homelessness. So it's really circular. Adults who identify as LGBTQ also experience violence and exploitation at much higher rates than other adults experiencing homelessness. About 1/2 of homeless LGBTQ adults said that they had stayed in an abusive relationship because they did not have other housing options available to them. 38% had been physically or sexually attacked while homeless, and 36% had been in a personal relationship with someone who was abusive within the last year. So experiences with violence and exploitation are both a cause of homelessness as well as a result of unsafe situations in which homeless adults may be forced to stay. And additionally, in 2018, Violence Free Minnesota, which I believe was the Minnesota Coalition for Battered Women at the time, also conducted a supplemental point in time count, working with programs across the state to kind of also provide some additional information about folks that were accessing domestic and sexual violence programs. And of all the information they collected, 1,092 people were attempting to flee a violent situation that day. Of those people, most, so 608 of them, stayed with the person who was causing them harm. 444 different people ended up staying with family or friends to try and find safety. And we know that 40 people stayed in a vehicle because that was the only other housing option to them. So again, we can see that domestic violence and sexual violence and homelessness are very intricately linked and sometimes indistinguishable. Some more updated information from the National Network to End Domestic Violence. This was information from, I believe, 2021. I believe, I'll correct that if I'm mistaken. Of the programs that they surveyed here in Minnesota, there were 2,421 victims who were served in one day. Of those, 779 adults and children were in shelter, and the remaining 1,642 non-residents were receiving other community-based services. They found that there were 859 hotline calls. So if any of you have been feeling very, very overwhelmed with all the calls, that means there's about 36 calls per hour to these agencies. And of all of these increased numbers that we're seeing, there were 328 unmet needs due to lack of resources. Anyone who has tried to find shelter for folks or works in shelter knows that shelter space is often hard to come by, whether that's because of family size or transportation or just general space. COVID had a huge impact, of course, but that's a huge number of unmet needs of any sort, whether it's shelter, transportation, legal, or otherwise. So we know that the need has continued to rise. And I think we've all kind of seen that. So why are we talking about all of this? And again, I think it's because housing is all about safety, right? Home should be a safe space. For victims and survivors, home is obviously, or maybe not so obviously, not a safe space for them. Sometimes the abusive person might live with them or know where they live, or know where they spend their time. And even if the victim lives alone, that still could be an unsafe space. So on top of that, we know that 99% of victims and survivors experience financial abuse as well. They may not have access to their own money, or their access is controlled by the abuser or harm doer, or there may not be any money to have access to in the first place because the abusive person prevented them from finding a job, for example. We often talk about victims trying to stash money away to help prepare them to leave an abusive relationship, and that maybe to make sure that they always keep gas in the car so they can flee at a moment's notice. And these strategies are definitely helpful for some people, but you also can't budget your way out of domestic violence. Another impact of financial abuse is on someone's credit score, which is also important for finding housing. So sometimes abusive people might take out loans or credit cards in a victim's name with or without their knowledge. And if that loan or credit card isn't paid, that stays on the victim's credit. So credit scores, while they're kind of a more recent idea, again, another kind of system that we bought into. It was only in the 1990s that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac began requiring credit scores for people to get mortgages. So it's a newer thing. And it's based on payment history, credit utilization, and length of credit history. And people that use harm know this. They know what it takes to get it to either buy a home or even to rent an apartment. And while there are some cities like Minneapolis that dictate when and how credit can be taken into account while looking for housing, many victim survivors are denied apartments or rentals because of that credit score. Financial abuse can also lead to a loss of housing completely, whether that's through repeated lease violations by an abusive person leading to an eviction, behaviors that lead to the loss of a voucher or other supportive housing, or an abuser who owns a home may choose to evict the victim survivor. So even if the victim survivor has plans to leave a relationship, they may not have control of if and when that might happen. So all of a sudden, the victim survivor is faced with an immediate housing crisis. One way an abusive person could exert control in housing is to control whose name is on the house or the apartment. If it's in the victim's name only, then only the victim can get evicted, and that victim will show up only on the victim's record. They may also owe money to landlords because of unpaid rent, and that debt follows the victim survivor and greatly impacts their ability to find housing, especially today. I think it's important to remember that while many people are facing an eviction, when it comes to domestic violence, that can be in part or in full related to the controlling and intentional behaviors of the abuser. Another difficulty many victims face is housing discrimination due to police calls or property damage done by an abuser. And if you have questions about that, definitely talk to Anne. That's a complicated one for sure, but that's definitely something to be thinking about and paying attention to. And then we also know that it can take an average of 7 to 12 attempts for someone to leave an abusive relationship in order to find safety. There's all kinds of numbers out there that might not be the most updated statistic, but we also know that abusers often find victims after they have moved, right? And they continue to try to exert their power and control in many ways. So that leads to really complicated housing histories. Whether that means someone has no rental history to speak of, has been to different shelters, has several evictions on the record, it can all look very risky to potential mortgage lenders and landlords. So if that happens, if someone has this complicated housing history and they also lack employment and other financial resources, that is impounded by the fact that we also lack affordable, safe housing options. Affordable is one thing, safe is another, and if you need them both, really, really difficult to find. So if someone is trying to get away from an unsafe situation and they're looking for housing and they're not able to find it, shelter is kind of the next best option if they're not able to stay with family or friends. And as we know, shelter space is hard to find. Shelter stays are really short or the space is full. So then you have a victim survivor who's experiencing homelessness. And as we kind of follow this circle around, it could lead, as we know from the statistics and the numbers that we just talked about, folks that are experiencing homelessness often stay in those unsafe situations. So getting out of that cycle can be really, really complicated and difficult. And then I just wanted to highlight a little bit more, talk a little bit more about the financial abuse, because again, we know that 99% of victim survivors experience economic or financial abuse. I'm hopeful that most of you know about Free From, which is an awesome organization. You should definitely check out their website, but they've got some of these stats here that talk a little bit about the financial burden of abuse and what that looks like for victim survivors. So not only are victim survivors experiencing all of these things we've been talking about today, in terms of the housing instability and crises that people have experienced, the different policies and practices, the victim survivors we're working with not only have those pieces in our history that they are dealing with today, they are also experiencing financial abuse and the lack of jobs that pay enough to rent somewhere. The housing crisis and the housing market does not make it easy to find housing these days. So there are so many pieces that victim survivors are navigating. And I think we all know that, you know, as an advocate, I'm sure you've tried to help people look into housing options, and it's very daunting to try and make that make sense. And again, keeping in mind that it's not the individual. We need to think about the systemic policies and practices that we've been talking about and how we got to where we are today. So now that I've painted this bleak picture for you, unfortunately, I apologize for that doom and gloom. Hopefully Kia can bring us to a different space and talk a little bit about what in the world can we do about all of this.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Raelene. I will try, and I wish I had all of the answers. These are just some things that we can try and do to push back against inequity and these gross housing policies and practices. And the first one, and these are in no particular order, but calling your representatives and telling them about the legislation that you want them to support and why it matters to you. You know, I think of ways such as like increasing access to down payment assistance or increasing access to affordable credit and investing in affordable homeownership. Just a few things. There are many, I believe, many different housing or like different legislation that is trying to be passed to push back against some of these things. But it's important to just like call your representatives, let them know. They love hearing from people. I believe so. I'm just going to tell you that because you should call them. And it may annoy them, but that's their job. And we're not doing something if we don't annoy them. And another, this kind of goes along with the next point, but just supporting legislation that is increasing access, housing access and affordability for everyone. And this isn't just about home ownership. This is about renters' rights as well, which leads to my the third bullet point here, and that's getting involved in your neighborhood. And this can look so many different ways, but it can mean getting to know your neighbors. I mean, we're stronger together. That sounds really cheesy, but it's very true. And when you get to know your neighbors, you feel a greater sense of belonging, and just community comes with that. So get to know your neighbors and, you know, bring them a cup of sugar like people used to do, if people still do that. I got eggs from my neighbors once, so I appreciated that. And educate yourself and your neighbors on your renting rights. That is another thing that you can do. You know, once you get to know your neighbors, maybe you have a little, I don't know, potluck, and then you just sit around and talk about your renting rights. I can't imagine a better night than that. Pay attention to new developments in your area. And when you notice that it looks like a building may be being put up, or you could like talk to or call your representatives and let them know that if this needs to be like an affordable housing unit, it's way more, it's a little bit more nuanced than just that, but pay attention to these things and connect with your neighbors, various folks within your community, city council members about the latest developments in your area and inquire and figure out what that will be used for. And self-education, extremely important, but do your research. Try and find some books on housing, and I think a really good book that I suggest everyone to read would be Evicted. It doesn't take place in Minnesota, but it's in Milwaukee, and I think it does a wonderful job of painting a picture of really discriminatory housing. Also, I'm really sorry if everyone can hear that. They're doing construction. And then lastly, just deeds. Raelene had highlighted this earlier, but it can help you figure out if you have a racial covenant on your home and how you can get it removed. But another thing that I think is really important to do is to figure out the land that you're on, like literally the land that you're on. And I just entered into the chat a way that you can do that. But we're talking about housing inequity, but I would regret not being able to mention the fact that we are on stolen land. And it just brings up this weird dynamic of we're talking about housing policies while, not mentioning and talking about the fact that land was stolen from our Indigenous relatives, and we're still waiting. I mean, they're still waiting to seek justice for that. And so just it's a whole mess. But there are definitely things that we can do, use our collective power to try and push for change. And again, seriously, get involved in your neighborhoods. I think I really can't highlight that enough. Even just getting to know your next door neighbor, just start with one, but you'll feel a really good sense of belonging from getting to know one person within your neighborhood. So that's all I have. I don't know if folks have any questions, but thank you so much for letting us talk with you all.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kia, for those action steps. I think it's really important, and I just want to echo everything Kia said. Get to know your neighborhood. I just found a local food pantry that's on one of the corners of my neighborhood, and that's a way to kind of stay connected with folks and see what people are needing. And a lot of these things happen on a very, very local level. So yes, we have federal legislation, we have state legislation, but we have city zoning codes and things like that. So paying attention to what's going on around you can be a really helpful way to get to know who's around, and maybe you'll find a local business that you didn't know about, or a new neighbor, or a new park, something like that. So yeah, explore close to home. That can be fun too.
Right, and because really, if no one's talking about it, if no one is mentioning or trying to figure out what this new development in their neighborhood will be, then the developers just know that they can continue building, right? We have to talk about these things. And I'm just really glad that you highlighted the fact that it starts on this local level. Well, I mean, macro and micro approaches, right? But we can be literally very local in the action that we're taking.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you all for joining us today, and for folks watching on YouTube in the future, thanks for spending some time with us talking about housing policy. I know it's a lot of kind of heavy things for sure, but there's a lot of ways that we can take care of each other and take care of our communities going forward. So hopefully that leaves you with some hope and some steps to take, and you can kind of go forth to explore your neighborhoods and get to know each other a little more.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much to Kia and Raelene for the presentation today. I don't see that there are any additional questions, but you all know you can contact us at any time if you have additional questions. So I don't see any questions in the chat as well, so I'm going to end the webinar.